Okay, so you know how we're all kind of fascinated by, relationships,
Hmm.
right? The choices we make, the connections we form. There's this idea in evolutionary psychology that's really popular. It's that our whole approach to mating, like whether we're looking for something short term or a lifelong partner,
Right,
maybe
right.
multiple partners versus just one,
Uh-huh.
is actually tied to like a deeper fast versus slow strategy for life in general. Is that some?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
that's the popular idea that, our mating preferences or our mating strategies are tied to a broader fast or slow life history strategy.
Yeah.
But the article we're looking at today, uh, from Evolution and Human Behavior, basically argues that this connection, and, particularly the connection through something like, our willingness to have casual sex or not, it's not quite as straightforward as we might think.
Okay.
So we're doing a deep dive to unpack this theory and really see if the links that are assumed actually hold up when you look at the evidence.
Okay, so let's start with this whole fast versus slow idea. Like, what exactly do we mean when we talk about fast versus slow in terms of like mating strategies?
Yeah, so at its heart, a fast strategy is generally characterized by, earlier reproduction, a tendency to have, more sexual partners,
Wow.
multiple sexual partners, and also lower parental investment in those offsprings.
Okay.
So more effort is going into finding mates and less effort is going into being a parent.
Okay.
Whereas the slow strategy involves delaying reproduction, having fewer partners over the lifespan,
Okay.
and, forming those, strong, committed relationships where both parents invest very heavily in their children. So
Right.
you have less effort on mating, more effort on parenting.
So they really do sound like they're almost like two completely different like philosophies when it comes to
Yeah, absolutely.
reproduction. Where did this idea of applying like a fast slow spectrum to human mating even come from?
So the inspiration actually comes from observations in the natural world. Biologists have long noticed that, across different animal species, you see these kind of patterns where life history traits, so things like, lifespan and reproductive rate, they tend to go together.
Right.
And so species with shorter lifespans often reproduce earlier and have lots of offspring.
Mhm.
The thought was maybe similar evolutionary pressures are at play,
Okay.
within human populations, pushing some individuals towards a faster reproductive style and others towards a slower one.
So we're seeing like echoes of these big trends in biology in our own
Yeah, in our own,
dating lives.
that's the suggestion. And a really key part of this theory, especially in how it's applied to humans, is the idea that our early environments
Okay.
play a really crucial role in setting us on one of these paths.
Okay.
And this is often called psychosocial acceleration theory.
Okay. So how does our upbringing supposedly steer us towards either fast or slow?
So the theory proposes that if a child grows up in a harsh or unpredictable environment, maybe with limited resources or instability in the home or, just a general lack of security,
Right.
this basically signals to them on a fundamental level that the world is a risky place and the future is uncertain.
Okay.
And in response, they might, biologically mature a little earlier, become sexually active sooner, and lean towards shorter-term, less committed relationships. The logic there being that, tomorrow is not guaranteed.
Yeah.
It makes more sense to reproduce sooner rather than later.
Right. It's kind of like a live for today
Uh,
reproductive strategy.
Right.
And then what about the opposite?
So in contrast,
Yeah.
really safe and stable environments with plenty of resources and, strong family support,
Okay.
those are thought to encourage a more slower life history.
Right.
Individuals in these kind of conditions, they might mature later, postpone sexual activity, and they'll really prioritize forming these stable, long-lasting pair bonds. And all of this with the goal of really investing in raising a smaller number of higher quality offspring.
Right.
So the idea is that a secure future basically allows for that kind of long-term investment in your kids.
So it's like our early experiences actually set our expectations about relationships
Absolutely.
and whether we can count on,
Mhm.
long-term parental support and stuff.
Yeah. And a really important concept that's used to link, these broad kind of strategies
Okay.
to like actual individual behavior is this idea of sociosexual orientation,
Okay.
which is basically how comfortable someone is with the idea of having sex outside of a committed relationship.
Okay.
And this has become like a really popular way to kind of measure where someone falls in that fast-slow spectrum
Right.
with more unrestricted sociosexual orientation, supposedly indicating a kind of a faster approach to life and mating. So
Hmm.
this willingness to have uncommitted sex is seen as a key behavioral manifestation of a fast life strategy
Right.
in this traditional view, right?
Right. That makes sense. Like someone who's more open to casual sex is seen as maybe prioritizing quantity over quality, or at least,
Right, or less investment per partner.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
I know that this deep dive is looking at kind of a challenge to this whole idea.
Yes.
What's the main argument this article is making?
So the article, Mating Fast and Slow. Sociosexual orientations are not reflective of life history trajectories.
Okay.
It directly challenges that central assumption.
Okay.
They're arguing that when you zoom out and you look at the bigger picture across different animal species,
Yeah.
the way they handle mating versus parenting doesn't actually drive this like broad, fast, slow life history dimension.
Right.
Variations in mating effort aren't central to that kind of fundamental trade-off.
Okay, so that's a pretty significant claim. What's the evidence for that?
So they point out that pair bonding and biparental care,
Okay.
things that we often associate with slow strategies in humans, right?
Mhm.
They don't neatly align with the fast-slow continuum that we actually observe across the animal kingdom.
Right.
So take birds, for instance. Pair bonding, which again in humans we would link to, long-term commitment and slower life history.
Right.
It's actually quite common in bird species that have what we would consider fast life histories, like geese,
Oh, wow.
as well as in birds with slow life histories, like albatrosses.
Wow. That completely upends what I would intuitively thought about geese. They don't strike me as like the most committed type.
Right, exactly. And even more surprisingly, in many bird species, when both parents invest in raising the young,
Okay.
which is what we call biparental care,
Right.
that's actually associated with faster rates of reproduction.
Oh, wow.
So the male's help allows the female to put more energy into producing more offspring. And this goes against the idea that, male investment is solely tied to slow strategies, where you have like fewer, higher quality offspring. So this finding really throws a wrench in the idea that male investment is only a hallmark of a slow strategy,
Right.
and that a lack of commitment, high sociosexuality in men, necessarily aligns with lower parental effort aimed at fewer offspring.
So the animal kingdom is not following this neat rule
Yeah.
that mating strategy equals life history speed.
Not really, and that's
Okay.
a key takeaway from their look at the cross-species patterns. They also highlight mammals.
Okay.
But bats, for instance, tend to have slow life histories. They live a long time,
Right.
but many species are not monogamous at all.
Right.
On the flip side, prairie voles, they form very strong pair bonds. They're monogamous, but they have relatively short lifespans and they produce multiple litters every year, which sounds more fast in some ways.
Yeah.
Even when they looked at primates, they didn't find a strong link between whether a species was typically monogamous or not
Mhm.
and their rate of reproduction or their position on that quantity-quality trade-off in terms of offspring. And this challenge that we're seeing in this broader animal kingdom, right? This mismatch between mating systems and like the fast-slow continuum,
Yeah.
it really sets the stage for us to look at humans
Right.
where things get even more interesting.
So it sounds like maybe we need to zoom out for a second and just like remember
Yeah.
what life history theory is really about.
Right, precisely. At its core, life history theory is about how living things
Right.
allocate their limited energy
Right.
over their lifespan
Right.
to maximize their chances of passing on their genes.
Okay.
And this involves some like really fundamental trade-offs.
Remind us of what some of those key trade-offs are.
So first, there's the choice between investing energy in reproducing right now
Okay.
versus, saving that energy to survive and potentially reproduce in the future.
Right.
And second, there's the trade-off between having a large number of offspring with low investment in each one, or having fewer offspring, but investing a lot more in their survival and development. And third,
Right.
especially for species that reproduce sexually,
Yeah.
there's the balance between mating effort, which is the energy spent finding and attracting mates, and parental effort, which is the energy spent raising the offspring.
So these are like the core decisions that every organism is facing in
Yeah.
this game of reproduction.
Exactly. And the authors of this article, they emphasize that the primary driver of that like fast-slow spectrum that we see across
Right.
different species,
Right.
it's really that first trade-off,
Yeah.
reproduce now or reproduce later.
Right.
The second most important one is the quantity versus quality of offspring.
Okay.
But what they argue is that the mating effort versus parental effort piece, and things like whether a species pair bonds or not.
Right.
Those are not the main engine driving this like broad, fast, slow pattern
Okay.
in the way that popular evolutionary psychology often suggests.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes the animal examples make a lot more sense.
Right.
Like, if mating behavior isn't really the key to the fast-slow continuum in general, then we shouldn't necessarily assume
Exactly.
that it is for humans.
It suggests we need to be really careful about drawing a direct line between something like, a preference for short-term relationships,
Right.
which would be high mating effort,
Right.
and a truly fast life history
Yeah.
that's all about maximizing current reproduction and offspring quantity.
Okay.
The evidence from the rest of the animal world just isn't consistently there to back that up.
Okay, so let's bring this back to humans. We are pretty unique creatures in a lot of ways.
We are, yeah.
How does human life history fit into all this?
So human life history is quite unusual.
Okay.
We have relatively long lifespans, low rates of mortality compared to many other mammals, and an exceptionally long childhood where we're dependent on others.
Right.
Interestingly, human females also invest a lot in reproduction.
Okay.
They have relatively short intervals between births. They produce offspring at a fairly high rate and have a high total number of offspring over their lifetimes.
Okay.
This combination of traits is actually a bit of an evolutionary puzzle when you compare us to other species and how they balance their energy budgets.
A puzzle? Why?
Well, generally you see a trade-off.
Yeah.
Those with shorter lifespans tend to produce more offspring
Right.
relative to their size and per unit of time,
Right.
and vice versa.
Right.
Humans, with our long lives, we seem to break this rule by also having relatively high fertility.
Okay, so what's like the secret to our seemingly contradictory life history?
So dominant theories point to the evolution of a unique adaptive complex in humans,
Okay.
which is tied to our ability to engage in complex foraging behaviors, like hunting large game,
Right.
which requires a long learning period.
Right.
This way of life also necessitated a lot of cooperation,
Oh.
for hunting, for sharing food,
Right.
and what's known as cooperative breeding, where not just the parents, but other members of the group help raise the offspring.
And how did this cooperative lifestyle affect our mating and reproduction?
So the increased efficiency of getting food through cooperation,
Okay.
especially the consistent provisioning by men,
Yeah.
allowed women to allocate more energy towards reproduction
Okay.
and have more children,
Okay.
because human kids take so long to mature.
Right.
Mothers often have multiple children of different ages
Right.
who are still dependent on them.
Right.
This stacked reproduction
Right.
is really made possible by that cooperative support network,
Okay.
and importantly, by the pair bonds
Okay.
that frequently form in human societies,
Right.
even if they aren't always lifelong or exclusive.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when men contribute resources, that male provisioning that we often hear about,
Right.
that's a crucial part of the equation for
Yeah.
human reproduction.
It seems to be a fundamental piece.
Okay.
The article highlights a really interesting finding from studies of hunter-gatherer societies.
Okay.
The amount of calories that men provide to the group
Right.
is strongly linked to women's total number of children
Oh, wow.
and how many of those children survive. It looks like when men contribute more to the food supply,
Okay.
women tend to have more offspring,
Right.
and those offspring have a better chance of making it to adulthood.
So that's a really key insight then, that male investment isn't necessarily just about having, a few higher quality kids, which we associate with a slow strategy.
Yeah,
It might actually allow women to have more kids.
exactly. From an energy perspective, it makes sense. When males invest in parental care by providing resources, it reduces the energy demands on females,
Okay.
freeing them up to invest more in producing and raising offspring.
Right.
This really challenges the idea that pair bonding and male parental effort in humans are primarily there to promote offspring quality at the expense of quantity.
Okay.
In some ways, it appears to do the opposite.
That really does make you rethink the traditional view.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the idea that women who have multiple partners are pursuing a fast strategy to, increase the number of offspring they have?
So the article raises some significant doubts about that as well.
Okay.
The most basic point is that a woman can only conceive one child at a time, no matter how many partners she has.
Right.
So having multiple partners doesn't directly lead to more pregnancies
Right.
or births.
Right. That's like a very obvious
Yeah.
but crucial point that's easy to overlook.
It is.
Yeah.
And furthermore, in human societies, where fathers and their relatives often play a significant role in raising children,
Right.
having multiple partners can actually be detrimental
Okay.
because it can lower paternity certainty,
Right.
which can lead to a reduction or even a complete loss of that male investment.
Right.
And as we just discussed, that investment seems to be really important for women's ability to have and raise successful offspring.
So the potential downside of losing male support might actually
Yeah, it might outweigh
any,
yeah.
theoretical benefit of having multiple partners
Exactly.
in terms of increasing,
Yeah.
offspring number.
Right.
Yeah.
The authors also touch on the offspring diversification hypothesis,
Okay.
which is the idea that by having children with different fathers,
Okay.
a woman might increase the genetic diversity of her offspring,
Okay.
which could be beneficial in unpredictable environments as a form of insurance.
Right. That sounds like it could make
Yeah.
sense from an evolutionary perspective.
While the idea of bet hedging through genetic diversity is plausible, the article points out that from a gene's perspective, having diversity across the offspring of different women in a community,
Okay.
where each woman has a child with a different partner, can achieve a similar level of risk reduction
Okay.
without the potential costs for an individual woman having multiple partners, such as increased social complexity
Okay.
and reduced paternal support for her children.
So it's not necessarily about each woman needing to
Not about each woman.
diversify her own offspring.
Right, exactly.
Uh-huh.
And given the potential costs for individual women,
Okay.
it's less likely that unrestricted sociosexuality in women primarily evolved as a direct strategy for increasing offspring quantity.
Okay.
This is really making me rethink some of the common assumptions about fast and slow mating strategies and what they actually achieve in terms of reproductive outcomes.
Oh, okay. So what about some of the evidence that seems to support this fast, slow idea?
Yeah.
Like the connection between when puberty starts and sexual behavior.
Right. So that's another area that the article takes a close look at. The thought is that, earlier puberty,
Okay.
which is often seen as a sign of a faster life history, should be linked to a more unrestricted sociosexual orientation.
Right. It feels like those things should logically follow each other.
You would think that if you mature earlier,
Right.
you'd naturally be more inclined toward, earlier sexual activity.
Right.
And maybe more partners.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
however, several large-scale studies have actually found very little to no correlation between the age at which a woman starts menstruating
Oh, wow.
and her attitudes about casual sex or her tendency towards short-term mating as an adult.
Okay.
While starting puberty earlier does tend to predict starting sexual activity at a younger age,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily mean like a lasting preference for uncommitted sex or a greater number of partners later on.
That is surprising. So early puberty might signal something about like the overall
It might.
pace of development,
Right.
but it doesn't seem to be a strong predictor
Yeah.
of mating strategy
Not necessarily.
in terms of like relationship preferences.
That's the implication.
Okay.
The authors suggest that earlier puberty might indeed be a response to factors like, poor health early in life,
Okay.
reflecting a kind of a faster overall life history.
Okay.
But it doesn't seem to be directly connected to a preference for unrestricted sociosexuality.
Yeah.
This all points to a much more nuanced picture of human mating
Yeah.
than a simple fast-slow dichotomy. So if our mating choices aren't just about living fast or living slow,
Yeah.
what other factors might be really important?
Yeah. What else is going on?
So the article suggests that human mating strategies are likely highly adaptable and depend heavily on the specific context. They're probably shaped by a wide range of things,
Okay.
such as, how much value people place on having a committed partner who can provide resources
Right.
versus just their genes, how reliable male provisioning is in their particular environment,
Yeah.
and a woman's own access to resources and social support networks.
So it's a much more
Yep.
complex cost-benefit analysis that
Yes.
we're constantly making.
Yeah, based on our individual circumstances and
Right.
the world around us.
So we need to look beyond the simple,
Yeah.
fast or slow label
Exactly.
and consider like a
Yeah.
much wider array of factors, right?
When we're trying to understand human mating behavior.
Exactly. The authors argue for the importance of using principles from sexual selection theory, which is about what makes someone an attractive mate,
Right.
and optimality theory,
Okay.
which is about how individuals make the best choices given their circumstances,
Yeah.
to really understand human mating strategies rather than just trying to fit everything into this fast, slow life history framework.
Right.
They also emphasize the need for more research in a wider variety of cultures
Okay.
beyond just those Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies.
Right. The weird society.
The weird societies, yeah,
Right.
that have been the focus of so much research so far.
So the big picture here is that while this fast, slow idea might capture some
Yeah.
broad biological patterns,
Yeah.
it doesn't really explain the complexities of human mating
Yeah.
and the link between things like our willingness to have casual sex and these fundamental life history trade-offs isn't as strong as we
Right.
thought it was.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
The evidence, especially when we look at other animals
Right.
and human foraging societies,
Right.
it doesn't really support the idea that a preference for short-term mating or an open attitude towards casual sex
Right.
is simply a reflection of a fast life history strategy.
Right.
Focused on having lots of offspring quickly.
Right. It sounds like understanding
Yeah.
why we choose the partners we do is
Sure.
a much more intricate and
Yeah.
fascinating puzzle than just figuring out if we're living life in the fast lane or taking it slow.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with a really thought-provoking question for you.
Hmm.
If our mating choices aren't fundamentally driven by a simple fast versus slow life strategy,
Yeah.
what other deep-seated needs, desires, and trade-offs might be truly shaping our relationships and what we look for in a partner?
Yeah.
It really opens up a whole new way of thinking about the complexities of human connection.
It does.